She looked at me like I was the only person in the world, and suddenly, nothing else mattered. The first time I saw her, it was impossible to ignore the way the world seemed to pause for just a fraction of a second. I remember walking into the small, sunlit café I visited every morning, the smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries filling the air, and there she was, sitting by the window, a book open on the table in front of her. She didn't notice me at first. Her attention was on the pages, but even from a distance, there was a kind of grace in the way she moved, the quiet elegance in her posture. She looked up as if sensing me, and our eyes met. That's when it happened. I felt a subtle tug at something inside me, something I couldn't name yet. Her gaze wasn't casual. It lingered just long enough to make my chest tighten, warm and unfamiliar. She didn't smile right away, but her eyes held a softness, a kind of quiet acknowledgement, like she saw me not just as another person in the room, but as someone with a story she wanted to know. There was a gentle curve to her lips as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and I found myself noticing the small details. The way the sunlight caught the gold in her hair, the slight crease at the corner of her eyes when she focused, the way she held her book with both hands as if it were a fragile treasure. It wasn't just attraction, it was fascination, the kind that made you want to memorize someone's every movement. I took a cautious step closer to the counter, my coffee forgotten for a moment, and caught her glance again. This time, there was a tiny, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. My mind raced. Was she really looking at me? Or was it just a coincidence? The rational part of me whispered that it couldn't be anything, yet the warmth spreading through my chest suggested otherwise. As I waited for my order, I noticed how she brushed the book aside and glanced out the window, her eyes tracing the rhythm of the city outside. There was an ease to her presence, a quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself, but somehow filled the space around her. I couldn't help but wonder about her life. What brought her here every morning, what stories those eyes had seen, what laughter and sorrow they had held. I didn't approach her that day. Part of me wanted to introduce myself and see if the connection I felt was real. But another part hesitated, unsure of how to cross the invisible boundary between stranger and confidant. Instead, I lingered in the periphery, drinking in the warmth of her presence, aware that this small moment had shifted something inside me. By the time I left the cafe, the image of her eyes, soft, attentive, and strangely familiar, was burned into my memory. I couldn't stop thinking about how she had looked at me like I mattered more than the rest of the world, and I realized that, for the first time in a long while, I wanted to see her again. Not out of casual curiosity, but because something about that glance had reached the quiet, unspoken part of me that longs to be seen and understood. And that was the beginning of everything. After that first fleeting glance, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I found myself lingering longer at the cafe, hoping, almost nervously, that I might see her again. And one morning, as if the universe had taken pity on my restless thoughts, she was there, seated in the same spot by the window, her book open once more, sunlight painting a soft halo around her. This time, our eyes met almost immediately, and there was a subtle acknowledgement in her gaze, a flicker of recognition that made my chest tighten again. Our first words weren't anything extraordinary. She commented on the morning light spilling across the wooden table. I mentioned how the coffee smelled stronger than usual that day. But even in these small exchanges, there was something remarkable, a rhythm, a silent understanding, as if we were carefully discovering each other through words that seemed almost incidental. I noticed how she listened when I spoke, tilting her head slightly, eyes warm and attentive, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup absent-mindedly. There was a softness in her voice, a gentle lilt that made even the most mundane conversation feel intimate. When she laughed at something I said, it wasn't a loud or boisterous laugh. It was quiet, delicate, carrying a kind of warmth that made me lean in slightly, craving just a little more of her attention. We began to talk more frequently, and the small touches that accompanied these interactions did not go unnoticed. A hand briefly brushing against mine as we reached for the same sugar packet. A subtle nudge of her shoulder when she laughed at a shared joke. Moments so fleeting they could be dismissed as accidental. But I couldn't shake the awareness of them, the way my heart seemed to recognize a connection before my mind fully understood it. I found myself paying attention to details I never thought I would. The way she would tuck her hair behind her ear with such elegance, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the aroma of coffee, the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself even when she was just standing in line or flipping a page. Every gesture seemed layered, as if each motion carried a piece of her story she hadn't yet shared. And beneath all of it, I could feel the gentle pull of something unspoken. It wasn't just attraction. It was a curiosity, a desire to know her, to understand her, to be noticed in return. But there was hesitation too, a quiet self-doubt whispering that I might not belong in her world, that I was just a passerby in the rhythm of her life. Yet every smile, every lingering glance, every subtle touch reassured me that this connection, fragile as it was real. By the end of that morning, as she gathered her things to leave, our eyes met one last time. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. There was a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that this was only the beginning. And as I watched her walk away, I realized that these small conversations, so ordinary on the surface, were shaping something extraordinary. Something that made me feel seen, noticed, and quietly exhilarated in a way I hadn't felt in years. In that moment, I knew that even the simplest exchange could carry the weight of possibility, and that the story between us was only just beginning. By now, our mornings at the cafe had become a quiet ritual, though still unspoken in many ways. I would arrive early, ordering the same coffee I didn't always finish, hoping she would be there. And more often than not, she was, her presence now familiar yet still breathtaking, like sunlight spilling across the room. But one particular morning, something was different. There was a weight to her movements, a subtle tension in the way she rested her hands on the table, fingers tapping lightly against the ceramic cup. I approached her cautiously, unsure whether to intrude. Her gaze met mine briefly, and I noticed the slight flicker of fatigue in her eyes, the way her shoulders seemed a fraction heavier. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. It was then I realized that beneath her graceful composure, there was vulnerability, a softness she rarely revealed to the world. I asked her if she was okay, my voice quieter than usual, almost hesitant. She paused, and for a moment, I wondered if I had overstepped. Then, slowly, she spoke, not about grand troubles, but about a lingering frustration, a challenge at work, a worry that had been tugging at her attention. The words were simple, but the honesty behind them struck me. I could hear it in her voice, feel it in the brief tremor of her hands, see it in the slight downturn of her lips as she recounted a small, personal disappointment. As she spoke, I found myself drawn closer, not physically at first, but emotionally. I leaned in just slightly, careful to respect the space between us, letting her know without words that I was listening. And she responded to that quiet presence, eyes softening as if relieved to finally be seen without pretense. A hand rested briefly on the table near mine, and though it didn't touch, it carried warmth, an unspoken trust. Her vulnerability didn't make her weaker. It made her human, approachable, beautifully real. In that moment, I noticed the subtle details that made her who she was, the delicate line of her jaw, the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the faint crease of concern between her brows when she paused to gather her thoughts. These small, intimate glimpses into her life made my admiration deepen, now tinged with a protective, caring instinct I hadn't expected. I wanted to offer comfort, a word, a gesture, even just my silent presence. And for the first time, the distance I'd felt, the hesitation born of her quiet confidence and my self-consciousness began to blur. Our shared silence became a bridge, connecting us in a way words could not. I felt a subtle shift, a gentle acknowledgement that we were no longer strangers exploring casual glances. There was now something more tangible, a quiet understanding forming in the space between us. By the time she left that morning, I realized that this vulnerable side of her, the moment she let the world soften around her, was just as captivating as her confident, graceful exterior. And I understood, more clearly than ever, that the story between us was not just about fleeting attraction. It was about noticing the unspoken, the quiet cracks in the armor, and being present enough to honor them. For the first time, I felt a responsibility, not just a desire, to be someone who could hold that trust, even in the smallest, most understated ways. And in that realization, the slow, gentle pull between us deepened, weaving emotional threads that would bind the next chapter of our story. As the days passed, our encounters became more familiar, but the quiet intensity of her presence never dulled. One afternoon, I noticed something different, a subtle weight in her posture, a softness in the way she held herself, as though carrying something unseen. We were seated at our usual café table, the hum of conversation around us fading into a background rhythm. And for the first time, she seemed less like the composed, confident woman I had admired and more like someone quietly navigating a private struggle. She spoke about small frustrations, a demanding project at work, a disagreement with a friend, a moment of self-doubt. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of exhaustion and vulnerability. I found myself leaning slightly closer, careful not to intrude, simply to let her know I was present. There was no need for grand gestures. The act of listening, of truly being attentive, seemed to ease some invisible burden. Her hands, resting on the table, moved with subtle hesitations, and I noticed the gentle way she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. That simple motion, so ordinary, felt intimate somehow, as if I were witnessing a part of her the world rarely saw. For the first time, our interaction wasn't just a dance of polite glances and light conversation. It became a shared space of trust. When she spoke, I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed slightly, the tiny, almost imperceptible curve of her lips when she found comfort in my attention. A warmth spread through me, not just from attraction, but from the quiet honor of being someone she could lean on, even briefly. Her vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was a delicate strength, a layer of authenticity that made her presence even more magnetic. I felt an urge to offer reassurance, to convey that she wasn't alone, but the right words were elusive. Instead, I simply nodded, met her gaze, and let silence carry the message. I was here and I understood. And in that silent exchange, a subtle shift occurred. There was a softness in her eyes, a fleeting spark of connection that made my chest tighten. In that moment, the world outside the cafe seemed to fade. The hum of the espresso machine, the chatter of other patrons, all reduced to a quiet backdrop of the conversation unfolding between us. As she prepared to leave, I realized something profound. Her vulnerability had opened a door, allowing me to see her in a way that went beyond surface impressions. It was the beginning of a deeper connection, one built on trust, empathy, and unspoken understanding. And even though our relationship was still in its earliest stages, I knew that these small, tender moments, the ones where she allowed herself to be seen, would shape everything that came next. Walking away, I carried with me the memory of her eyes, soft and searching, and the quiet realization that the story between us was growing richer, more nuanced. Her vulnerability had not only drawn me closer, it had anchored me, making me want to be present, careful, and wholly attentive to the delicate rhythm of her world. And for the first time, I understood that true intimacy didn't rush. It unfolded quietly, patiently, with moments like this paving the way for everything to come. It started with small, almost incidental moments. Moments that, on the surface, seemed ordinary but carried an undercurrent of tension neither of us could ignore. One afternoon, we found ourselves walking along the crowded streets near the cafe, her schedule coinciding with mine by chance. The sidewalks were bustling with people, umbrellas bobbing in the drizzle, the scent of rain mixing with the faint aroma of coffee shops. In a narrow space, we naturally walked side by side, shoulders brushing occasionally. At first, I tried to dismiss the awareness that sparked in me each time our arms met, the subtle electricity of contact that lasted only a second longer than necessary. I caught the way she tilted slightly toward me, unconsciously making room, and how her hand occasionally brushed against mine when adjusting the strap of her bag. Each accidental touch seemed magnified, charged with the quiet thrill of proximity. Her presence, so close, felt both grounding and dizzying, like standing at the edge of something I wanted desperately, yet feared to step into. Later, as we waited for the elevator in the building where she had an appointment, the moment became even more intimate. The small space confined us, her warmth radiating just inches away, and I became acutely aware of the subtle rise and fall of her breath. Our eyes met in the mirrored wall, and for a heartbeat, it felt as if time had contracted. The soft click of the elevator doors and the gentle hum of its ascent faded into background noise. In that tight, fleeting space, I realized how every small movement, her adjusting her scarf, the way her hair fell across her cheek, the barely perceptible shift closer to my side, was a form of silent communication. Even our laughter carried weight now. A minor mishap, her dropping a pen, my reaching to pick it up, became an excuse for our eyes to meet again, our smiles lingering just a fraction longer than normal. Each accidental brush of our hands sent a jolt through me, a mix of warmth, desire, and hesitation. I noticed the scent of her perfume, subtle yet intoxicating, the warmth of her coat brushing against mine, the soft cadence of her voice as she apologized lightly, almost shyly. What struck me most was how effortless she was in these moments. There was no conscious intention, no overt flirting, just presence, subtle signals, and the unspoken acknowledgement of each other's existence. And yet, the closeness carried weight, making my heart race, my thoughts scatter, and my curiosity deepen. I wanted to prolong every moment, yet I was careful not to impose, sensing that the magic lay precisely in its delicate balance between intimacy and restraint. By the time we parted that day, the sense of connection had intensified. The accidental touches, shared laughter, and proximity had woven an invisible thread between us, a thread of awareness, tension, and unspoken desire. Even as she walked away, leaving the drizzle behind her, I felt her presence lingering, the memory of her nearness etching itself into my mind. I realized that romance wasn't always in grand gestures. Sometimes it was in these fleeting, accidental closenesses, where every brush of skin and glance held the potential to transform the ordinary into something quietly extraordinary. And in that realization, I understood that the slow, steady pull between us was no accident. It was building moment by moment, touch by touch, glance by glance, drawing us inevitably closer to something neither of us could ignore. By now, our connection had grown quietly but unmistakably. The morning rituals, the accidental touches, the fleeting glances, they had built a rhythm between us, a subtle understanding that went deeper than words. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone at the café, the usual hum of the city softened by the gentle drizzle outside. She seemed quieter than usual, and I sensed that something had been weighing on her, an invisible tension she hadn't shared before. I didn't ask immediately. I simply sat across from her, letting her know through presence alone that I was there. There was a softness in her eyes as she finally spoke, a hesitant beginning, almost a whisper. She talked about a regret from her past, something small yet deeply personal, something she rarely admitted to anyone. The words were carefully chosen, but the emotion behind them was raw, unguarded. I could see the way her hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee cup, the faint rise and fall of her chest betraying the vulnerability she carried beneath her composed exterior. As she spoke, I felt a shift in our dynamic. This wasn't just casual conversation anymore. It was a quiet offering of trust, a bridge from her heart to mine. I leaned in slightly, careful not to crowd her, letting the silence between words speak volumes. When her eyes flicked to mine, I met her gaze fully, letting her see that I understood, that I respected the courage it took to share something so personal. In that moment, the world outside ceased to matter. The chatter of the cafe, the rain against the windows, even the clinking of cups became distant echoes to the intimacy unfolding across the small table. There was a brief pause, a shared breath, and then she touched my arm lightly, a fleeting yet deliberate gesture that anchored the moment. The warmth of her skin, the gentleness of the touch, conveyed more than words ever could. She trusted me. My heart tightened, and I felt the pull of emotions I hadn't fully acknowledged until then. It was a subtle, profound intimacy, a realization that connection wasn't built in grand declarations, but in the quiet moments of honesty and openness. I responded not with advice or reassurance, but with presence. I listened, offered the occasional nod, and met her gaze with a steady warmth that said, without speaking, "I see you. I understand you. You're not alone." And she responded in kind, a soft exhale escaping her lips, a hint of relief in the way her shoulders relaxed, the faint curve of a smile emerging as if released from restraint. That afternoon, I realized that what we were building wasn't fleeting attraction. It was trust, a slow, deliberate trust that allowed us to be vulnerable in front of one another, to share parts of ourselves we rarely expose to the world. And as she gathered her things to leave, our eyes met one last time, lingering with unspoken understanding. In that gaze, I felt the quiet acknowledgement that this connection, this delicate, tender intimacy, was now mutual. Walking home, I carried the memory of her hand on my arm, the softness in her eyes, and the unmistakable feeling that something meaningful had shifted. The story between us was no longer just glances and small touches. It was trust, the kind that deepens with patience and care. And in that slow, steady unfolding, I felt certain that whatever came next, we had already begun building something real, anchored in honesty, respect, and the quiet power of emotional intimacy. The connection between us had grown slowly, carefully, each moment building toward something neither of us fully understood but both deeply felt. It wasn't a sudden spark. It was a steady warmth that had settled into the spaces we shared, in the pauses between words, in the silent understanding of glances. And then, one rainy afternoon, that slow burn found its first tangible expression in touch. We had walked together under a shared umbrella, the city streets glistening with rain, umbrellas bobbing around us like floating blooms. There was laughter in the air, not forced but soft and spontaneous, carried by a quiet sense of comfort. The umbrella was too small for both of us, forcing our shoulders to brush repeatedly, each accidental touch sending a small, deliberate shiver through me. It wasn't awkward. There was a naturalness to it, a subtle intimacy that felt like a secret known only to the two of us. As we reached a quiet bench in the park, she paused to adjust her scarf, and I found my hand instinctively reaching out to help. Our fingers met lightly over the fabric, a brief, deliberate contact that seemed to slow time itself. The warmth of her skin through the soft wool sent an unexpected thrill through me, a mixture of nervousness, awe, and an undeniable recognition of the growing closeness between us. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand lingered, and in that small moment, the world outside, the drizzle, the distant chatter, even the rustle of leaves, faded into background noise. We sat side by side on the bench, close enough that the warmth from her coat seeped into mine, a subtle comfort that made every ordinary sound sharper, every glance heavier with meaning. She turned slightly toward me, her head tilting just enough for her hair to brush against my shoulder. I felt the soft rise and fall of her breath, and in that rhythm, a kind of silent intimacy formed, a language without words, conveyed entirely through presence and touch. Then, in a gesture so simple it almost seemed accidental, she rested her hand lightly on mine. It was brief, deliberate, and grounding, the weight of it carrying more than any conversation ever could. I felt her pulse, a quiet steadiness that mirrored my own racing heartbeat, and in that touch, I understood the depth of the bond we had been building. This wasn't about desire alone. It was about trust, comfort, and the first real acknowledgement of something deeper. For a long moment, we said nothing, letting the quiet between us speak volumes. Every accidental brush, every lingering glance had led to this, a first meaningful touch that solidified the invisible thread connecting us. And as the rain continued to fall around us, soft and persistent, I felt the unmistakable truth. We were no longer merely observers in each other's lives. We had begun to inhabit the same space, heart to heart, in a way that was slow, deliberate, and profoundly moving. When we finally stood to leave, our hands lingered together for a heartbeat longer than necessary, a silent promise carried in warmth and touch. I walked away with her presence etched into me, the memory of that first meaningful contact marking a turning point. The slow burn had reached its peak, not in words or declarations, but in touch, grounding us in the reality of our growing connection, a quiet, YouTube-safe intimacy that felt endless in its significance. After weeks of subtle gestures, lingering glances, and carefully built moments, the connection between us had reached a point where words felt almost unnecessary. That afternoon, the cafe was quieter than usual, the sun spilling golden light across the wooden floor, catching the dust motes in slow, lazy dances. She was there first, seated by the window as always, her book forgotten for once, eyes scanning the room until they met mine. That simple, intentional look, soft, attentive, lingering, made the world narrow down to just the two of us. I walked toward her, heart steady, but alive with anticipation. She stood as I approached, and for a moment, time seemed to suspend itself. The noise of the cafe, the rustle of chairs, the soft hum of conversation, all of it faded, leaving only the quiet rhythm of our shared presence. I could see it in her eyes, the same warmth, the same gentle acknowledgement that had drawn me in from the very first glance. But now, there was something deeper, a calm certainty that our connection was mutual, intentional, and entirely real. We sat together, close enough that our knees brushed lightly under the table. It was the kind of closeness that didn't need explanation, the type of intimacy that had grown from months of shared moments, vulnerability, and trust. She reached across the table and rested her hand atop mine, her fingers warm against my skin, grounding me. I held her hand gently, feeling the steady beat of her pulse, the quiet strength beneath the softness of her touch. It was the kind of contact that spoke volumes, conveying reassurance, affection, and the unspoken promise of presence. We talked quietly, our conversation flowing effortlessly, punctuated by laughter that felt both natural and comforting. But even in moments of silence, there was an electric tenderness, an awareness of each other's presence that needed no words. I noticed how her hair fell just so across her shoulder, the faint crinkle at the corner of her eyes when she smiled, and the subtle shifts in posture that mirrored my own. Every detail was vivid, intimate, and grounding, proof of the journey we had shared and the emotional depth we had reached. As the afternoon wore on, she leaned slightly toward me, her cheek brushing against my arm in a gesture so fleeting it could have been accidental, yet deliberate enough to resonate deeply. I felt the warmth radiate, a quiet affirmation of trust and mutual affection. In that instant, I realized that our story wasn't about grand declarations or dramatic confessions. It was about presence, attentiveness, and the slow, deliberate building of intimacy over time. When it was time to leave, we stood together, our hands finding each other naturally, interlaced as if they had always belonged there. Outside, the sunlight framed her silhouette, soft and radiant, and she looked at me with that same gaze that had captivated me from the start. It wasn't longing or desire alone. It was recognition, connection, and a profound, unspoken understanding. As we parted, our fingers lingered in a gentle squeeze, a quiet promise that this was only the beginning of a shared path, yet also a complete moment in itself. Walking away, I carried with me the certainty that I had been seen truly and fully, and that I had witnessed the same in return. The slow burn had resolved into something steady, warm, and profoundly human. A romance built on trust, subtle affection, and the kind of intimacy that lingers long after words are spoken. In that quiet resolution, I understood something essential. Sometimes love doesn't arrive in fireworks. Sometimes it arrives in glances, touches, and the patient unfolding of hearts willing to see and be seen. And in that understanding, I felt complete.